Professor Sukhdev Thorat, Professor Rajshekhar, distinguished invitees, research scholars of the Institute, young students from this institute as well as from other universities. Many thanks for honoring me to deliver and asking me to deliver this year's Dr. VKRV Rao Memorial Lecture. I'm grateful to Dr. Sukhdev Thorat and Dr. Rajshekhar for inviting me to deliver the lecture. Dr. VKRV Rao is one of India's most distinguished economists. He played a key role in shaping India's economic policies immediately after independence. His contributions were immense and touched many areas. Particular reference must be made to his article as well as a book on national income, which helped India to construct a solid base for computing national income. He was also an academic who turned to politics at one stage and became a cabinet minister under Nehru. He was a great institution builder, Delhi School of Economics, Institute of Economic Growth, and Institute for Social and Economic Change, where we are all meeting here today, are three institutions which he helped to found, and these are among the tallest institutions in the field of economic research and teaching in our country. Among the various articles that VKRV Rao wrote, I wish to bring to your attention one that I consider as the most significant. That was the article entitled Investment, Income and Multiplier in an Underdeveloped Economy, published in 1952. In this article, Dr. Rao explained in detail why the investment income multiplier, as expounded by Keynes, does not operate in underdeveloped economies. This is because of the inelastic nature of the supply curve in underdeveloped economies. He said, and I quote, "My conclusion therefore is that the multiplier principle, as enunciated by Keynes, does not operate in regard to the problem of diminishing unemployment and increasing output in an underdeveloped economy, and an increment of investment based on deficit financing tending to lead more to an inflationary rise in prices than to increase in output and employment." And he concluded that article by saying, and I quote again, "The old-fashioned prescription of work harder and save more still seems to hold good as a medicine for economic progress, at any rate as far as the underdeveloped countries are concerned." Many changes have happened in India since that time. Despite the sweeping changes that have happened in the last 7.5 decades, the relevance of what he said holds good, if not in full, but at least partially. We see that application even in the aftermath of COVID-19. One of the standard prescriptions prescribed for meeting the problem that arose as a consequence of COVID-19 and the lockdown which had to be imposed in order to prevent the spread of the disease was increased government expenditure. Almost all policymakers agreed on that. I think there is no doubt about what should be done. But what will be its consequence? The consequence is that at a time when supply was not expanding because of a variety of reasons, pushing government expenditure beyond a point does result in inflation. You see that more clearly, not in India, but much more in the United States and equally. In the United States, President Trump went to the extreme of providing every individual with a cash dole. And as a result of it, the borrowing program of the federal government increased. And that could be met only by accommodative policy by the Fed, which resulted in a huge expansion of the balance sheet size of the Fed. The consequence of that is today, United States is experiencing a level of inflation that it had not seen for the last 4 decades. I mean, I'm not here today to speak on that subject, but I would only say that there is a great element of truth in what VKRV Rao said at that particular time. In paying a tribute to Dr. VKRV Rao, I propose to talk to you on India's economic journey since independence. India's economic journey started really with independence. It is not realized often that India's economic progress in the first half of the 20th century, that is between 1900 and 1950, under the British rule, was dismal. During the 5 decades, India's annual growth rate was 0.9%, with the population growing at 0.83%, per capita income remained almost flat. Many people do not realize it. Many people talk about what the British have done, what the British gave to India and all that. They did many things, but at the same time it is a fact that the national income growth was less than 1%, population was increasing more or less at 1%, and therefore per capita income remained flat over the period. It is therefore not surprising that after independence, growth became the most urgent concern for policymakers. The dominant view in the literature in the 1950s and 60s was that government had an important role to play and that it should undertake activities that would compensate for what was described and what economists very often call market failure. And market failure was perceived particularly in the area of allocating resources over time, that is investment, because of the myopic character of the participants. That is, investment may not be forthcoming because the participants could not foresee where India could grow. And therefore, as a consequence of this, the literature emphasized the role of government in initiating and supporting economic activities. The literature also emphasized at that time the benefit of what might be called a coordinated and consistent set of investment decisions. Namely saying, if the steel output has to increase, investment must be made in coal also. Investment must be made also in iron mining and so on. Therefore, a consistent set of investment decisions will lead to a better augmentation or better utilization of resources. It is this line of reasoning that led most emerging or developing countries to formulate economy-wide plans. Though India adopted a mixed economy, the mix was tilted heavily towards state, at least incrementally. At that particular period, India's strategy of development comprised of four elements. One is what I said before, emphasizing the need for emphasizing the role of the state. The second was emphasizing the need for raising savings and investment. Some of you students of economic development would have known the famous quote from Arthur Lewis. And Arthur Lewis said in 1954, and I quote from Arthur Lewis, "The central issue for development economics was to understand how a country which saves 5% of its income is transformed into one which saves 20% of its income." So the idea was that it is essentially the summary of the Harrod-Domer model, namely that what is important is a level of savings and investment, and if you operate it, then growth will come. Much of our own 5-year plans was based on that. So the role of the government, the role of savings and investment, and the import substitution, and domestic manufacture of capital goods. These were the four elements of the strategy of development. The intellectual support for an emphasis on heavy industry-led growth came from the Mahalanobis model, which in my opinion was strictly valid only in a closed economy. But the export pessimism that prevailed at that time went in support of the approach of import substitution. One consequence of this approach was that India became a high-cost economy. The net result was that India's share in world exports, which stood at 2% of the world trade, fell to 0.5% of world trade by 1973. And in fact, even as of today, after liberalization and so on and so forth, it has not yet gone back to 2% of world trade. The latest estimate that I have seen is 1.8% of world trade. To some extent, policymakers in the 1950s and 1960s were handicapped. At that time, there was no clear model available for accelerating growth in developing countries. State intervention on an extensive scale seemed to be appropriate, even though there were some critics even at that time. However, by the end of the 1970s, it was becoming clear that the model we had chosen needed changes, needed modification. By that time, there were many more critics of the strategy. But our policymakers refused to recognize this. It was around that time that China made a big change. And let me quote from the famous Deng speech. The famous Deng speech, delivered on 13th December 1978, in that he called to, within a quotation marks, explore new ways and generate new ideas. That is what Deng said. It is interesting to note that in 1980, in current dollars, India's per capita income was 266, while that of China was 194. China's per capita income in 1980 was less than the per capita income of India. In 2020, India's was $1,900, while that of China was $10,500. Of course, one cannot attribute the big difference to only a change in policy. By embracing, therefore, I believe that what was required was a change in the model. It is not as if one is getting away from or one is denouncing the model. The point is, in the light of the developments in 1950, 60, and 70, what changes needed to be made. It was a crisis of 1991 that compelled the policymakers to turn to an idea whose time had come. The break with the past came in three important ways. The first was to dismantle the complex set of licenses, permits, and controls that dictated almost every aspect of the economy. Barriers to entry and growth were dismantled. The second change in direction was to reverse the strong bias towards state ownership of means of production and proliferation of public sector enterprises in almost every sphere of economic activity. Areas once reserved exclusively for the state were thrown open to private enterprise as well. And the third change in direction was to abandon the inward-looking trade policy. By embracing international trade, India signaled that it was boldly abandoning export pessimism and was accepting the challenge and opportunity of integrating with international trade. This approach is very different from what we used to do when faced with a BOP problem. There is a common thread running through the various measures introduced since 1991. It is to improve the productivity and efficiency of the system. And this is sought to be achieved by introducing a greater element of competition. Barriers to entry and growth were removed. The changes in the industrial policy, which resulted in the removal of controls and permits, enhanced the competitiveness of Indian industry domestically, while the change in the foreign trade policy of allowing to compete with the rest of the world brought about the international competitiveness of Indian industries, subject, of course, to the degree of protection offered by tariffs, which themselves were being brought down. As I mentioned earlier, some of the areas which were exclusively reserved for the state was also thrown open to the private sector. But in many of those areas where state had a monopoly, it had to compete with private sector, but they still played a dominant role in that particular sector. That needs to be noted. And there is, however, this is what I would like to underline. There is, however, nothing in the new economic policy that takes away the role of the state or the public sector in the system. The new economic policy of India has not necessarily diminished the role of the state. It has only redefined it, expanding it in some areas and reducing it in others. As it has been said somewhat cryptically and paradoxically, more market does not mean less government, but different government. The role of the government in the provision of the physical infrastructure and the social infrastructure increases under the new dispensation rather than diminishes under the new dispensation. What has been the impact on the economy because of the reforms? Did India's growth rate pick up? Did the BOP situation improve? What happened to inequality in income and poverty? Very quickly, India's average growth till the end of 1970s remained modest, with the average growth rate being 3.6%, with population at that time growing at 2.2%, the per capita income growth rate was extremely modest at 1.4%. But that doesn't mean that there was no transformation in the economy. There was considerable amount of transformation in the economy. If you look at some of the social and health indicators, like the literacy rate or the life expectancy at birth, there has been significant changes. While India had to rely initially on a heavy import of food grains, the big breakthrough happened after the Green Revolution. The industrial base also widened. India became capable of producing a wide variety of goods, including capital goods. While India's post-independence economic performance was reassuring compared to the pre-independence period, it is not that impressive when compared with several developing countries, even in Asia. When I say even in Asia other than South Asia. We had very many neighbors who didn't do that well. But there is a table which I had prepared, where I have shown how between 1950 and 1970 or 1980, many other countries during this particular period moved faster than what we did. Many people do not know that in the 1950s, the per capita income of South Korea and India was the same. And today, whatever it is that we have moved fast, the per capita income of South Korea has reached that of a developed country. So there is something in the way the others have done. Leave aside that. I mean, I think there can be many reasons whether what is applicable to a small country applies to a big country, whether export-led growth is applicable to a large country like India as it has applied to South Korea and so on. But the fact remains also that our rate of growth fell less than our own expectations. You look at every 5-year plan. Every 5-year plan said that the rate of growth of the economy should be 5%. Look at the fifth 5-year plan. The fifth 5-year plan said that the rate of growth of the economy should be 5.5%. As somebody said, the obsession for 5 reached the highest in the fifth 5-year plan, and it touched 5.5%. So even that we fell short of it. So the Indian economy did grow at 5.6% in the 1980s, but it was accompanied by sharp deterioration in the fiscal and current account deficit, and the economy faced the worst crisis in 1991-92 when the growth rate fell to 1%. It is extremely doubtful if without a change in the strategy of development, growth would have picked up. However, it must be admitted that the 1980s did see the beginnings of reforms, but the conviction to break totally with the past was not there. Let's now come to the reform period. Between 92-93 and 2000 and 2001, GDP at factor cross grew annually by 6.2%. Between 2001-2 and 12-13, it grew by 7.4%, and the growth rate between 2013-14 and 2019-20 was 6.7%. The best performance was between 2005-6 and 2010-11, when the GDP grew by 8.8%, showing clearly what the potential rate of growth of the Indian economy. This is the highest growth experienced by India over a sustained period of 5 to 6 years. This is despite the fact that this period included 2008-9, which was the international global crisis year. During this period, the investment rate reached the peak of 39.1% in 2007-8. Correspondingly, there was an increase in the savings rate also. The current account deficit on the BOP, the current account on the BAP remained very satisfactory, and the average deficit during this period was 1.9% of the GDP. However, the growth story suffered a setback after 2011-12. The growth rate fell to 4.5% in 2012-13, according to the 2004-5 series. According to 2011-12 series, the corresponding figure is 5.5%. The downturn after 2011-12 was a result of many causes. I have written a lot on that, but let me briefly summarize what I say. Why did the economic growth fall after 2011-12? That one is purely cyclical. In the sense, previous 8 years or 6 years, the economy has grown strong. The capacity utilization was highest. And as students of trade cycle theory, we all know that it reaches a peak, and then it creeps on the ceiling, and then comes down. Therefore, this is to be expected, that after a tremendous increase in the growth rate, it will begin to fall. But my point, as I explained later, is the downturn was not managed properly. If the downturn was managed properly, probably the declining period would have been less, and we would have started increasing again. Another thing that happened was, people talk about all the increase in the non-performing assets in our country. That is again attributable to the fact that during the period from 2005-6 to 2011-12, the credit growth was very strong. You can understand that. The real growth was strong, and therefore credit growth was also strong. But once what happens? The growth begins to fall, then some of the projects which were considered to be viable earlier became non-viable. Not many people understand this. It is not that the project ab initio was bad. The project ab initio was valid. But as growth started declining, what was originally viable became non-viable. And the accumulation of the non-performing assets contributed once again to the decline in the growth rate. And the other thing is the fact that 2008-9, faced with an international financial crisis, the government decided to go on a big expenditure spree. This did result in the economy growing in 2009-10 and 10-11. But this also resulted in a huge inflation. And I think it was April 2010 when the inflation reached a peak of 10.9%. Once I can go back to VKRV Rao, what he said. So you can really push the economy by deficit financing. But if it's not followed by an increase in production, you will end up with an inflation. Then there are other factors about which I have talked, and I think I will not spend time on that. Delay in the clearance of projects and so on. Therefore, this also resulted in the I-core becoming higher. The decline in growth rate, which started well before the advent of COVID-19, should make the policymakers reflect and introspect. The growth performance since 2012-13 is a bit difficult to interpret. The introduction of a new series on national income with a base 2011-12 has raised many controversies. The methodological changes introduced, particularly introducing the MCA 21 data for estimating or calculating manufacturing growth, has not found general acceptance. Therefore, in some sense, there is always a difficulty in comparing the new series with the old series. But the fact still remains, two things which is very clear. There has been a sharp decline in capital formation, from 33.4% of GDP in 2012-13 to 28.8% in 2019-20. And the growth story cannot be completed, of course, without a reference to two recent developments. One is COVID-19, and the other is the Russian-Ukraine war. In fact, the decline in the growth rate in the first year was 6.6%, that is 2020-21, and a rise in growth rate by 8.7% in 2021-22. Therefore, what is the net result? At the beginning of this year, we are exactly what we were 2 years ago, that is 20 March 2020 March, April. And as I have written today in the Hindu, the whole point is how will be 22-23. On 22-23, there have been expectations. There was even an expectation of rate, it will be 8%. I thought even at that time it was too optimistic. But then there are other developments like the Russian-Ukraine war. But given the first quarter growth rate that has been announced a few days ago, my estimate is that the rate of growth of the economy in the current year, 22-23, will be about 6.8%, if we assume that the growth rate for the second, third, and the fourth quarters will be the same as what RBI had used earlier. If there is a pickup, maybe we can get to 7%. But that's not enough. I think I will come back to it towards the end. The 22-23 could have been the first normal year, but that is not so. And the consequence of the war has been the rise in the basic intermediates like oil. As a consequence of it, prices have gone up. And also there has been supply disruptions of various types. As I said, for this year, I think we should not expect really not more than 7% as the possible rate of growth. This ties in with what I had said at the beginning, that the analysts, in my opinion, make two mistakes. The analysts keep on saying inflation is there in India because oil prices have gone up, crude oil prices have gone up, and many others, so therefore it is. It is my opinion that there is no theoretical basis for arguing that a pure cost-push inflation exists. It does not. Take a household with a budget constraint. If the income is at a level X, and supposing the price of one commodity, let's say food, goes up, what happens? The household can spend only less on some other commodities. So long as the budget constraint holds, cost-push inflation cannot exist. What has happened is that in order to get out of the COVID-19, we had actually provided adequate liquidity. That many people talked about it as being necessary. It is that which is coming back now when there are increases in the crude oil prices, there is an increase in the general price level. I had written 2 articles on this much earlier. Those of you who are interested can talk to me, then I will cite those articles which you might want to read. The other question is, when analyzing the income phenomenon, analysts keep on writing, private consumption demand has not picked up. And therefore, from the demand side, they are saying that the economy is not going up. This is another theoretical mistake. Consumption is a function of income. It is not the other way around. Consumption will increase only when income increases, not the other way around. You can say the investment income multiplier, as VKRV talked about, will hold good if there are no supply constraints. That is, you look at the investment income multiplier, the way it works. As the A spends 80 out of 100, then 80 becomes the income of the next household, then it essentially means that he will spend, let us say, 64 out of it. But assumption is, then when he demands 64, output will also come as 64. That is when investment income multiplier operates in a real sense, not in a monetary sense. Therefore, I tend to somewhat upset when I read people talking about private consumption demand is not picking up. Private consumption demand will not pick up unless income increases. Consumption is a function of income. Anyway, let me get back to the other things. I think, am I running late? Yeah. Let me very quickly come to BOP. I consider the way the BOP has turned out in the post-reform period is a success story. If you look at it, in most of the period, the current account deficit has been low. As I mentioned earlier, about less than 2%. In fact, in the first phase, it was clearly less than 2%. In the second phase, it was more than 2%. There are only 2 years, 2011, 12, and 13, where the current account deficit exceeded 4%. That did create a problem. But it also, but the fact of the opening up of the inflows of capital into the country has enabled us to accumulate reserves, and the reserves are helpful in a situation like this. I could say a lot more on BOP, but let me not spend more time on it, but refer to only one thing. The accumulation of reserves by India is different from the accumulation of reserves by China. India's accumulation of reserves has happened because of the excess of capital inflows over the current account deficit. China's accumulation of reserves is a result of balance of trade surplus, current account surplus. These are two different things. I mean, what essentially becomes important is, in the accumulation of reserves in India, what are the durable capital inflows and what are the volatile capital inflows? The volatile capital inflow is the portfolio investment. Because when sentiments change, shares can be easily sold in the market and money can be taken back. In fact, whether it is taper tantrum in 2013 or the Russia-Ukraine war, the problem has risen only because people have withdrawn the funds from the country. Instead of the funds coming in, funds were going out, and that is what resulted in a fall in the value of the rupee. So we need to take a good care of the volatile elements. But I have also argued in one of the articles that the purchasing power parity theory, which was always quoted for explaining the behavior of a currency, it implies that the external value of a currency is a reflection of the domestic value of the currency. If our inflation rate runs much higher than the inflation rate of other countries, ultimately the value of our currency will depreciate. We have seen so many capital inflows, so much, and our reserves still continue to be above $600 billion. But it's also true that in 1993 or 94, the dollar value of the rupee was 33.7. Today, it is running at 79 plus. You may also recall, at least some of you, that in 1952, the value of the dollar was equal to 4.75. So what is it that has happened? In the final analysis, two things need to be held in view. One is the current account deficit. I have argued elsewhere that the current account deficit should not exceed 1.5% of the GDP. That I consider to be the level of durable capital inflows. Second, I argue that the explanation for 4.75 to 80 is that our inflation rate has been running always at a much higher level than the rest of the world, particularly the developed world. And that is why it is happening. You see, in the US and in Europe, the inflation target is 2%. Of course, it has gone bad and it has touched a very high level now. But normally, the target is 2%. Only now we have set a target of 4% with a margin of plus or minus 2%. But before that, we didn't have an inflation target and inflation has been rising higher. So while I would say that the management of the BOP has been good, we really need to take care of 2 points. One about the domestic price situation and the level of the current account deficit. I have also written something on the poverty ratio and the need for looking at another dimension of what you might call growth or development. I think the purpose of growth, the purpose of accelerating the growth of the economy is not simply to have an aggregate which is higher. There's also an importance in ensuring that the benefits of growth accrue to as many sections of the society or not. The point is, many people look at inequality coefficient, like Gini coefficient and so on. I have argued elsewhere that may be a way of looking at it, but that is not the way to look at it as far as developing economies are concerned. The first step is reducing the poverty in the country. I'm not saying that inequality as such has no role to play. It is important to reduce inequality. But the first point really is to see that the poverty ratio must be reduced. And there is, and what has been the record? The point really is that whenever the growth of the economy has been strong, then there has been a significant reduction in the poverty ratio not because of growth alone, but because of many policy measures that could be taken in order to reduce or in order to benefit the lower income people, what we call social safety nets. I will only quote one. Using the Tendulkar expert group methodology, the overall poverty ratio came down from 45.3% in 93-94 to 37.2% in 2004-05 and further down to 21.9% in 2011-12. The per year reduction in the percentage points in the poverty ratio in the earlier period was 0.7 and in the latter period 2.18. The annual per capita income growth in the first period was 4.3% and in the second period 6.7%. Therefore, I believe that a high growth supported by appropriate measures in providing social safety nets can bring about a reduction in the poverty ratio. On this point, on this issue, there are some big questions. For example, we have been using the consumer expenditure survey of National Sample Survey to estimate this. But the National Sample Survey numbers are a matter of concern now. The aggregate consumption as derived from the national income accounts is vastly different, is big. There's a big difference between that and the aggregate consumption derived from the National Sample Survey. Now it has reached a point at which it is only 50%, one is only 50% of the other. I think this is, we really need to look at it. Now also another thing, that some people say whether the poverty ratio measured through the consumption expenditure is the most appropriate thing. Others talk about multi-dimensional poverty index. But let me quote one from the multi-dimensional poverty index. The report on Global Multinational Poverty Index 2018, released by UNDP and Oxford University, says, and I quote from that report, India has made momentous progress in reducing multidimensional poverty. The incidence of multidimensional poverty was almost halved between 2005-6 and 2015-16, climbing down to 27.5%. The global multidimensional poverty index was cut by half due to deeper progress among the poorest. Thus, within 10 years, the number of poor people in India fell by more than 271 million, a truly massive gain. This is indeed high praise. But I don't want to rest on this. I think this is all right, what they said about 2015-16. What has happened since then is a matter of concern. The growth rate has not been high. It has been fluctuating. And the social safety nets have not been further strengthened. And therefore, what is really needed at this point is really to maintain a high rate of growth, combined with appropriate policies to reduce poverty. Because the higher rate of growth enables the government to acquire more revenue, to get more revenue, and that revenue should be utilized in such a way that the condition of the poor is taken care of. And if that is done, then I think at least by another 2 decades, we can really reduce the poverty to zero. Then possibly we can move on to the other areas of even dealing with inequality. I want to conclude with 2 more set of ideas. What about reforms? The reform the introduction of reforms has had a favorable effect on growth. I have a table in which I have indicated the decennial growth rate from 1950 onwards. And as for the decennial growth rate, you see in the 1950s, it was 3.88. In 60s, 4.06. In the 70s, it's 2.93. In 1980s, 5.69. 1992-93 to 99-00, 6.39. 2001 to 2009-10, 6.9. And 2010-11 to 2019-20, 6.83. Therefore, there is enough evidence to show that reforms can lead to higher growth. Therefore, the reform agenda must continue, and policymakers should identify sectors that need reforms, of creating a competitive environment and improving the performance and efficiency. The center and states must be joint partners in this effort. The power sector, the financial system, governance, and even agricultural marketing need reforms. But we need more discussion and consensus building. Timing and sequencing is equally important. In my opinion, labor reforms are best introduced when the economy is on the upswing. To be credible and acceptable, reforms must not only result in higher growth, but also benefit all sections of society. In that sense, let me underline, in that sense, reforms are not ends in themselves. At the same time, equity will remain a dream if it is not supported by growth spurred by reforms. Reforms, growth, and equity must form the triad of economic policy. All the three are mutually reinforcing. Finally, what are the challenges and opportunities as we stand today in the next 20 years? Post-COVID-19 and post-Russia-Ukraine war, there is a need to lay down a clear roadmap for India's future development. Initially, we need to raise the growth rate to 7% and then follow it up with a growth rate of 8 to 9%. Is this possible? We have shown in the past that we can have a growth rate of 8 to 9% for a continuous period of 6 years. That is the potential rate of growth of the economy. What is needed is to raise the investment rate steadily back to around 33% of GDP. This will require a big effort. While public sector investment, particularly in infrastructure, may crowd in rather than crowd out private sector investment in crisis years, this cannot be the permanent solution. Private investment, corporate as well as non-corporate, must pick up. Obviously, technological changes will have an important impact on investment of various types. I think the one is raising the savings and investment rate. The second is the ability to face up to the new technological changes. Some of the technological changes are going to affect us in a very severe way. The extension of artificial intelligence to many, many more areas can pose problems, not only to India, but also to many developed countries as well. It is not something peculiar to us alone, but there is a problem. Today, Belgium has gone on to a 3-day weekend and 4 days of work, because there is no opportunity, there is not enough work for the people. But then you will have to increase the social safety nets to take care of the people. But technological change has two implications. One, what it does to the present mode of production in the various industries. And the most classic example is the automobile industry. People talk about electric vehicles. If electric vehicles replace internal combustion engines, then there's going to be a big change. Because we are told that as a result of the electric vehicles, the need for various kinds of services as is now needed may not be there at all. And then what happens to the balance of payments? Yes, our dependence on crude oil may go down, but our dependence on chips may increase. Therefore, one has to really calculate what the new technological change will do for us. Will we move into the new areas like the chip industry? The employment implications are even more widespread. On the whole, the future development of industry, agriculture and other service sectors will require considerable amount of planning and thinking. Bearing in mind the need for faster growth and containing the current account deficit to a minimum, we should enhance the investment rate. While FDI is welcome in order to promote investment, it must be understood that ultimately it has also a relationship to the current account deficit. On the strategy of development, many people talk about alternative strategies. One strategy that is being talked about in the light of East Asia was export-driven growth. For a large economy like ours, is that an ideal thing? But China proved for even a large economy, export-led growth is possible. And but Therefore, the point is, let me put it very simply, the strategy of development for India cannot be unidimensional. It cannot be just the promotion of export growth. It has to be, we need a strong manufacturing sector, domestically, both with a view to meet the domestic demand as well as provide employment, a wide cross-section of talent. Our own sunrise industries will be different from the sunrise industries of other countries. In this category, the food processing industry must get a high importance in our country so that our agriculturists can earn more. India's ability to grow between 7 and 8% is a proven fact. As already emphasized, we need to raise the savings and investment rate and keep the I-core at 4, which is a reflection of the efficiency to which we use capital and labor. Growth is the answer to many of your socio-economic problems. In a fast-growing economy, we can take care of the community's social problems more easily. We have been talking recently about a $5 trillion economy. After that, COVID came, and then the Russia-Ukraine war. So we are already behind 2 to 3 years. Simple arithmetic calculations will show on some assumptions of exchange rate and price behavior, we need to grow between 8 to 9% for nearly minimum of 5 years. Even then, at the end of it, India's per capita income will only be $3,472 and will still be classified as a lower middle income country. After 2 more years, we will become an upper middle income country. To get to the level of a developed country, for which the definition is the per capita income should be $12,695. Arithmetic calculations indicate that it will take 2.5 decades to grow at 8 to 9%. That is the challenge before us. We talk glibly about becoming a developed country. That is possible only if India grows for the next 25 years between 8 to 9%. And then only we can become a developed country. We talk about the fact that India is the 5th largest economy in the world. That is because India is a large country also. And in terms of per capita income, we are in the bottom 1/3, not in the 5th largest. It is possible for our, but let me not underestimate or undercut what we have achieved. Being of the 5th largest economy is probably an impressive act. And perhaps in the next few years, or 5 years, we can even become higher up. Perhaps UK will come down and we will move up to 4th or the 3rd. But in terms of per capita income, we are still way below. And therefore, in terms of per capita income, we have to go a long way. We must certainly need to run fast, or shall I say faster. Thank you very much.